from the virtual waiting room. We're just going to let people come in before we start. We're just going to give people a few minutes. It seems that people are very prompt to virtual events, I've learned. More prompt than they were in real life. At least I am, but that's because I'm going to have to come through from the other room, so less distance to travel. You can't say, oh, my train was delayed. All right, great. We've got loads of people coming in. And as you know, you can, as we're now very au fait with Zoom, you can toggle speaker view or gallery view with that little button up in the right corner. And you'll see that you're joined muted. So what we'd like to do is to ask people to stay muted while our speakers are presenting. And then for the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, then we can bring you in, and I'll say a little bit more about that, how those questions are going to work in just a moment. George, how's the waiting room looking? Shall we make a slow start?
I think we're happy to start, yeah. Thanks, right. Amy.
Great, so welcome everybody. Thanks very much for putting aside your afternoon to join us for this session, the latest session from our LGBTQ oral history special interest group. My name is Amy Tooth-Murphy, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. We've got 4 fantastic speakers lined up. This is the first time we've had 4 speakers for these events, so we have the luxury of time. We've allocated ourselves a little bit more time. We've allocated 2 hours, which we may or may not use. We'll see how the questions go, but each of our speakers is going to speak to us today for around 10 to 15 minutes, just to give you an indication of time frames there. Before we get started with the papers, I'll just hand over to Claire Summerskill, our chair, who's going to just welcome everybody and tell us a little bit, I guess, about the LGBTQ SIG for those of us who don't know. Claire?
Yes, hello everyone. Absolutely delighted to see you all, and a special hello to people who aren't sort of London based, where we have many of our meetings, that we perhaps, these Zooms have been an amazing way of reaching people around the country and getting to know new people and new projects that, as I said, we might be able to not physically meet up with before. So hello especially to all you. Hello to anyone who's new to what we call as shortened term the SIG, which is the Special Interest Group, which is short for lots and lots of words, which is the Oral History Society LGBTQ Special Interest Group. So that's us, and we just call ourselves the SIG. So as you know, shorthand, you'll know what we're talking about. We formed, I think it was 4 years ago now. Alan Butler and I decided that we were going to go to the Oral History Society and say we'd like a special interest group, because they were asking who wanted special interest groups. Alan Butler is the vice chair. George, who's set up this whole event, is our secretary, and Martha Robinson Rhodes, who you can't see but is attending, is our membership secretary. So the main aim of why we set up was really to we knew that LGBTQ oral history was getting more and more popular, and we wanted to find out what each other were doing and what kind of work we were involved in, whether it was community projects or academic projects or a whole range of exciting things are happening, as we're going to hear about today, just a few of them. But that was one of our main reasons for setting up, was to link up with each other and learn from each other and share with each other. So one of the other main ambitions when we first set up was to have an oral history journal special edition for our LGBTQ SIG, and we actually achieved that. So this year, for those who haven't become members already, if you become members this year, you'll get a free copy of the Oral History Journal, displayed by my assistant there up on the corner. And that had articles by many SIG members, and it was just absolutely thrilling to be a part of that and to see it come into fruition. So that was an aim that we achieved. If anyone wants to become a member who isn't a member, it's very simple. All you have to do is tell us and join the Oral History Society. Simple as. So contact George. You've got his email address. I'll put mine up. Martha might put hers up. Any of us will tell you how to do it, and then you can know what events we're doing, what's happening, you know, where we are. And lastly, to mention that our AGM is in October, date to be confirmed, but please feel free to, if you get some information about that, to listen in, because it will be a Zoom event, and we'll probably do something fun and interesting as well as all the AGM business. So hope to see you then. But meanwhile, back to Amy and all these wonderful speakers, and really looking forward to this event, and thanks to George for organising it.
Thank you, Claire. So as you know, we are here today to hear about LGBTQ voices from the 4 nations, and no prizes for guessing which of those nations I am from. However, now relocated to England for some years now. I'm looking forward to hearing about OurStory Scotland and what they've been getting up to in the meantime. What we're going to do today is, for those of you who haven't attended an event like this yet, we're going to have the chat function is going to operate as our sort of Q&A repository. So if you've got a question that occurs to you or a comment that occurs during the presentations, if you could enter them in the chat box, and George will be monitoring that through the event. We'll take all the questions and comments at the end. And you can also use the raise hand function, or you can type your question out in the chat box. George will then invite you to ask your question, or you can just have George ask the question on your behalf when all the speakers have finished. As I said, we ask people to keep their microphones on mute for the duration. However, it's up to you if your camera is on or off. You can have it on, you can have it off, or you can come on for the Q&A, whatever suits you at all. So I'm just going to hand over to our first speaker now, and we're going to, as I say, we're going to run through the 4 papers together before we have some Q&A. So first up, very pleased to welcome Sandra Baker-Donnelly, who's going to talk to us now about queer voices from Sheffield.
Hi, thanks for that, Amy, and thank you to George and everyone else for setting up the meeting. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome, that's great. Okay, so yeah, I've been researching Sheffield's LGBTQ history since about 2009, when I did my master's at Sheffield Hallam University, and that formed like my dissertation for that, which was like just a brief study of local history using oral histories and archival research as well. I went all the way down to Hull Carpenter Archives, which was great. And then I kind of had a hiatus a little bit from that. And then in 2018, I joined up with 2 other local queer historians, Chris and Mark, and we produced a zine together. I shall hold this up here. So this was our aim was to kind of get this ready and take it to the next coming Pride in Sheffield, and we did it, and we sort of gave away or sold just shy of 100 of those on the day, and we've had really good feedback from it. There seems to be like a definite thirst for people to find out about their own local history, so that's really great. So following on from that, we've developed a website, and we've launched a project called Our Steel City. And it's a project where we want people to send us their story. So send us a story of a place in Sheffield that holds importance to them. This kind of follows on from the zine, because the zine has, let's just find this. In the centre of the zine, we have a little map of Sheffield. So in a way, people could sort of use it as a little walking tour. But so what we wanted was to find other places that were significant to local queer lives and local queer people's history. So we're asking people to write a 500-word story about the place that's important to them. And then what we'll do is add that to a map. And the map is on the website. I will put the link to the website in the comments after this. So we just launched that last week, which is really scary. We've had lots of really good feedback as well from that. And thank you to everyone who's been really nice and shared that and everything for us. So what we're hoping for is that some of those contributions will develop into oral histories once we can meet with people again and safely conduct those, and we might, they might sort of grow into other things. So what about Sheffield then? So a lot of you might know about Sheffield. This is a bit weird for me because I've done this talk a couple of times, but to local people, so I don't normally have to sort of do a little preamble about Sheffield. But yeah, obviously I'm guessing most of you know what Sheffield is. It's one of the largest cities in the UK, and people think of maybe snooker and trams when they think of Sheffield. But it's not yet quite found its place in wider UK queer history. It's not really mentioned anywhere in any of the larger texts. A couple of notable exceptions to that would be Helen Smith's book, Masculinity, Class and Same-Sex Desire in Industrial England, which focuses more or less on Sheffield, but also the north of England between 1895 and 1957. And also the Friends of Edward Carpenter is a local group who've done a lot of work to sort of raise the profile of Edward Carpenter's history and his story. And they're raising funds as well for a statue of him to be erected in the city. So other than those two examples, I think we've been lacking a little bit in our queer history. And so where Helen's work sort of ends in the 50s, mine kind of picks up. So I've kind of done work from the from the 60s onwards, really, just based on the people that I've been able to talk to. And I think it's worth noting that the work I've done is based on like ordinary people's lives, and I think that's been a little bit of a barrier for some of the people I've wanted to talk to, in the sense that they've maybe thought that their life wasn't interesting enough to be a part of a project like this. And I think that there's a bit of a backdrop of these queer histories of these heroic things like Stonewall and the Pride movie, these big kind of amazing stories where everything goes right in the end, and perhaps those narratives have made a picture of a history that ordinary people don't have a part in, but they do, and I'll try to convince them of that all the time. So I just wanted to use the time that I've got to give a very short illustration of some of the ways that I think Sheffield's LGBTQ history is so interesting. And this is to do with the ways that people in the community use spaces such as bars and pubs and other spaces. And so I'm going to read you a few little snippets of oral histories that I've done. And there are some F-bombs in here, I'm sorry in advance. So one of the guys I talked to was called Trevor. He told me a lot about cottaging in Sheffield, and this quote isn't about that, but I just really loved the way that he talked about all the spaces that he used. It wasn't just, oh, I went to that bar and that bar. So he talked about one of the earliest gay bars in Sheffield, which was accessed. It was a room above a pub in the city centre, and the pub was called the King's Arms. So he said, and there was a bar with some seats around it, and that was it. But to get to it, you had to come through the straight pub, and you always got comments. You got comments about, oh, fucking puss and all this lot, and you just learned to ignore them. So I think it just goes to show that Sheffield's queer community was kind of already sort of living chick by jowl with the straight people and sharing those spaces in some cases, and having to kind of really push to be able to occupy the spaces that they were wanting to use. Oops. Okay. So as time went on, more bars opened in Sheffield that were gay friendly, and most of those ended up in a suburb of Sheffield called Attercliffe. You won't know what that means, but yeah, many women found those spaces to be quite unwelcoming, male-dominated, aggressive sort of spaces, which is probably something that's resonated through a lot of other places as well in the UK. So I have a few quotes about that from some of the women I spoke to. Caroline spoke about the Cossack, which was a bar in the city centre. There was the Cossack, which was rough as fuck. And then again, there was very definite demarcations. There was Dyke's Corner in there, and then fights over the pool table, and it was scary. And then Leslie said about a different bar. Leslie, there was a little club on the Attercliffe called the Amber Lee. It was a converted terrace house. It was very small, a lot more men than women. And we used to have to go in through the door and knock on the door, and they used to open this little hatch, and if you looked like a lesbian, you got in. So I always got in. At this time, there was still quite a lot of the butch femme stuff going on, which was a throwback from when lesbians started coming out. So if the femmes went on their own and tried to get in, they wouldn't get in. But they had to be with a butch lesbian. So butch lesbians were quite in demand, actually, because we could get the femmes in. So I think it's a quite interesting quote, really, about the gatekeeping, I guess, that was going on within the gay community as well, within the LGBT community. And some women did enjoy their time in these bars, obviously, despite this and despite the kind of codes of behaviour that were sort of apparent. But other people chose to sort of branch out from those spaces and actually went to spaces that were outside the gay scene. There's one pub called the Hole in the Wall that I was always told, oh, if you want to do Sheffield history, you've got to talk about the Hole in the Wall. It was like this big lesbian bar, all these lesbians went there. Okay, fine. But then when I did my first oral history interview, the woman I spoke to said it wasn't a lesbian bar, they just went in there. It was just a normal pub, but they piled in one night a week and occupied one of the corners in the pub. Sort of, and I think the landlord maybe just kind of begrudgingly allowed them to stay there, which I found really interesting, that they would rather do that than maybe go to a gay bar to have a lesbian group meeting. So what she said, this quote is shortly after she was talking about the Hole in the Wall. She said that they later, once the Hole in the Wall closed, they moved to a different pub, which was again a straight pub, but they just piled in there, called the Royal Standard. The landlord knew that there was this group of women that came in on a Monday night, and it was like the women's corner, right? But we all presented a well-behaved face. And then it used to get bigger, like 20 women there or something. And there were some young women there, and they were playing pool or something, and they were kissing. And he said, out. And we thought, actually, we're sitting here quite closet, really. We can't tell them not to kiss because this is a lesbian support group. So Ross went on to explain that things like this were part of the reason why she and other women decided to set up something called a women's cultural club in Sheffield in the 1990s. So it was not exclusively lesbian, the women's cultural club, but it was mainly, I think, established by and run by lesbian women, and was obviously like a friendly space that queer women could go to and be together, which was evidently lacking in Sheffield, both in the straight realm and in the spaces in the gay scene as well. So I think that's really telling, actually, about how they were made to feel in the gay bars. And then also in Sheffield, I mean, I could kind of go on about this, and I've sort of tried to not talk too much about all these different things that women did, but I think Sheffield was kind of known in the 80s and 90s as being this sort of like centre of like lots of feminist things going on, lots of lesbian activity going on. There was a women performers night at the Lead Mill, which I'm reliably told had busloads of people coming to it from all over the place. It was once a month, and the performances weren't perhaps that great, but people wanted to go there and be with these other women, and that was at the Lead Mill, which is a fairly big venue. There was a women-only theatre group as well. They performed a adaptation of Calamity Jane called Calamity Takes the Stage, and there's a poster for that currently on display in the Western Park Museum as part of a little LGBT local lives exhibition, which I can send the link for that. And so that was a kind of like a lesbian retelling of Calamity Jane that was put on entirely by women in Sheffield. There were various women's discos. I think, yeah, there still are women's discos in Sheffield, obviously, but those seem to have been happening in straight pubs, and rather than in the gay bars, and so that there were a lot of those. And then there was a garage called Gwenda's Garage, and this was like a car garage where people took their cars to get repaired, but it was all run by women as well, just out of somebody's house in Crooks, I think, which is just like one of the suburbs of Sheffield. So I think it just goes to show how Sheffield women weren't prepared to sort of compromise on the spaces that they were in, they were prepared to kind of go out and find other places to be comfortable in. And obviously there's a lot more stories I could tell about Sheffield's LGBT community, but I've kind of kept it to that for today.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Thank you. That was fascinating. A good friend of mine lived in Sheffield for a few years, and I'm going to now ask her how many of these names of places that she was familiar with. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. We will move straight on to our next speaker. Just a reminder for those of you who were coming in as we were talking about this, we're recording these speaker sessions, but we'll stop recording for the Q&A. So just to make you aware that we're recording at the moment. So our next speaker is Philip Rivers, who is going to talk to us today on an oral history of transgender people in Northern Ireland. Philip.
Okay, just checking everybody hear me? Okay. I thought that wasn't going to work there for a second after checking it for the first time. So my name is Philip Rivers. I'm a second year / third year / I don't know because of coronavirus PhD student in Queen's University in Belfast. So I was supposed to be in the middle of my oral history fieldwork at the minute, but Corona decided to throw a spanner in the works for that. So I'm now working on I'm looking at the social movement itself in Northern Ireland for trans rights through a desk-based approach, which I will talk about in a moment. So just a bit of background about myself. I started off by looking at LGBT domestic violence for my undergraduate dissertation, and sort of realized that whilst it's highly important to have T within the broader LGBTQ plus rubric, the T is very different, and a lot of times it leads to very skewed research because you often find that beyond the actual spelling out of the acronym, particularly within academic work, transgender people aren't mentioned beyond this is what LGBT means. So we're also talking about a gender issue rather than sexuality, and of course you have sexuality mixed in with gender, because obviously a lot of people, I think, particularly people that aren't familiar with the trans community, tend to think that trans people become, you know, they're just heterosexual men or women, but we do still have people who are, you know, gay and transgender. So it's important to acknowledge that as well. So beyond that, I have a criminology background. So I looked at the media reporting of transgender people in prison. Unfortunately, that was slightly skewed towards trans women in prison, because trans men in prison just aren't really considered to be, and I quote because I hate this, but newsworthy. So we tend to focus on, you know, the horrendous, which I'll not get into, but the horrendous kind of stereotypes that particularly the tabloid media play up with trans women, and a lot of it's actually based on, you know, prison dramas from years back, you know, that were fictional TV shows that still carry forward to today. So moving beyond that, then I happened, while I was studying my master's, I happened to meet my current PhD supervisor, who is and I'll get her title right, I've written it down, the regional networker for the Oral History Society in Northern Ireland, which is Dr. Anna Bryson. So she's my primary supervisor. I highly recommend you check out her work. I'm just going to plug her here because she's a legend, and I could not have gotten through this coronavirus pandemic and this PhD without her. So just, yeah, she's great. So just to give a bit of background then, obviously I've mentioned about the fact that we have sort of skewed research findings with, you know, T being lumped in with LGB and not really looked at beyond that. So as trans research began to emerge in the 1970s, it started off as what was termed the gender deviance paradigm, which is where it was highly medicalized and they were using trans people as objects of study. Whereas in the late 1990s, trans people became a subject of study instead. So it was important that they became sociologically significant in their own right, worthy of legitimization and empowerment. So they looked at what matters to someone rather than what is the matter with someone. So we move towards allowing trans people to tell their stories and give themselves voice. So the gender difference paradigm is viewed as championing sexual and gender diversity rather than viewing individuals as pathologized, deviant, and in opposition to the male and female binary. So such work is crucial for understanding cultural change about transgender rights and developing policies that address transgender discrimination. So I'm now going to turn to just give you a brief background about Northern Ireland, because we have a very complex history, and that is it forms a lot of the backdrop of why I'm carrying out this work at the minute, because we have some quite different and unique societal issues, which then inform how the likes of transphobia and microaggressions and things like that manifest. So I'm going to blast through this, because we're talking about 400 years of Irish history and 100 years of Northern Irish history. So we could probably take quite a while for that. Generally, the LGBTQ population certainly in Northern Ireland, to an extent in the Republic, but it has moved on quite a lot. They're viewed probably least favourably in terms of all marginalised groups. There's also very little research has been carried out beyond healthcare access and educational experiences of transgender individuals, and that tends to be mostly in the Republic of Ireland. There's been very little has been carried out in Northern Ireland, and I think part of the reasoning behind that is the services aren't here in Northern Ireland. So if even to try to get HRT in Northern Ireland, which is hormone replacement therapy, is pretty much impossible at the minute, from what I was told by the Transgender Resource Centre and Transgender NI, which is one of the NGOs here. The waiting list for HRT and just to get access to a gender identity clinic hasn't moved in 2 years, and that was about a year ago I was told that, so it's possible it hasn't moved in 3 now, particularly with obviously everything that's happened with 2020. Beyond that, then there's no real robust data about how many trans individuals we have in Northern Ireland, because it's not really tracked. So they think that trans people make up around 0.6 to 1% of the population, so it's quite low, but it tends to be reported on as these people being a drain on, the taxpayers' money and all these sort of horrendous tropes that I don't really like to repeat because it's just not very nice. So it's often made out that there is a lot more trans people within the population than there actually is, particularly if you pay attention to Twitter and the recent JK Rowling stuff, which I will not get into either. With Northern Ireland itself, there's what's called A2 community rhetoric. So this is a theoretical framework which is going back to the 1970s during the Troubles. So it's considered that there is unionist / Protestant and nationalist / Republican. Republican people want the union of an all Ireland, so for Northern Ireland to break away from the UK and for the island to become a whole again. Obviously there's divergences within this, and it's a lot more complex than just Republicans want this, Republicans want this, and Unionists want that. Unionists tend to want to maintain the union with the UK. So obviously then we had a religiously divided society, an arena of guerrilla warfare, majority dictatorship, and a besieged democracy. This is all just quotes that's been used to describe Northern Ireland. So because of this kind of back and forth between, basically the DUP and Sinn Féin who dominate our political arena here, it leads to the silencing of other communities, particularly the LGBT community, because of course we have LGBT people who identify as unionist or Republican, but a lot of our, we didn't have Stormont for almost, which is our executive. We didn't have that for almost, I think it was 3, maybe pushing 4 years, because of these spats between the likes of the DUP and Sinn Féin. So it leads to basically a silencing of all other kind of communities to be able to air their grievances. Plus, on top of that, we have the issue that there's inflexibility within politics in Northern Ireland, and conservative hegemony that basically dates back to the early 19th century. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with words such as heteronormativity. Northern Ireland is particularly conservative. It was dominated by, Presbyterianism, and we had the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign, and we only recently got gay marriage because Stormont had collapsed and it was put through from Westminster. And as I actually thought they would have went as far as to try to fight that, but it was put through alongside abortion access for women, and that's caused a little bit more controversy with the sort of conservative people. So we've been able to sort of slip gay marriage through under the radar almost in Northern Ireland almost by accident, unfortunately. So Northern Ireland's obviously then, it's dominated also by hyper heteromasculinity. So that's, we have an issue with paramilitaries here. And there has been incidences where not just trans people, but LGBT people in general have had to, leave communities or have been the victims of paramilitary style attacks. And, there's plenty of research out there on that, and it is something that I hope to look at. So I will just briefly touch on one of the things that I'm most interested in with obviously the idea of sectarianism and paramilitary style policing. So I would like to probe the impact of sectarianism and religious and political divisions on those who identify as transgender, how in such a politically binarized environment, on top of obviously a very rigid gender binary in Northern Ireland, how does somebody identify as trans within that very unique environment, on top of obviously the likes of the two community rhetoric and the things that I've already touched on. So my analysis of particularly transphobia will be contextualized within this, but also other sites of discrimination. So we're going to obviously put transphobia in tandem with racism, xenophobia, homophobia, particularly homophobia, because obviously the lines can be very blurred there. And obviously sectarianism, which is another massive issue. So this will help to highlight what's distinctive and discrete about transphobia, and bring in a degree of what's called intersectionality, which is from a feminist author called Crenshaw. I think intersectionality is very important to my work because often with particularly feminist writings, we look at transgender people and we put them in this little box, but we also don't necessarily acknowledge that, as I've said, a trans person could be gay, lesbian, bisexual, but also maybe suffer from mental health problems, may also say, for example, be on the autism spectrum. They may be living in poverty. There's so many other issues that need to be considered. So it's very important to me to represent the entire of the trans lived experience, and not just the experience of being trans as somebody's entire identity and life. Another element of my work is obviously then looking at the social movement. So a lot of the movement, particularly within Northern Ireland, is influenced by the Republic of Ireland and the UK. So the Gender Recognition Act has carried over to Northern Ireland, and then obviously the Gender Recognition Act in the Republic of Ireland, it was considered to be one of the most advanced in the world. So they're now looking at reforming the UK version of that, but of course that's been met with considerable controversy if you read Twitter at all. I've lost my train of thought. Where was I? Yes, so I'm going to look at that particular social movement then, and the likes of the Dr. Lydia Foy case, who championed for trans rights down south. The trans movement itself in Northern Ireland is very, it's been quite small and fragmented. We had our first Trans Pride event with an actual march only last year. However, I think it's changed now, but at the time there was some controversy between different factions and different people within the trans community, some of whom didn't really want to associate with the Trans Pride event that happened last year. I think there's been some movements now to rectify that, and I think the community is slowly coming together a little bit more. But it is quite interesting that within Northern Ireland, there is, for such a small trans community, there is actually some fragmentation and, differences of opinion. My best friend happens to be trans, and she doesn't consider herself to be a trans activist and does not want to be associated with the movement because she's obviously struggling with her own issues. So I find it quite interesting that there are trans people who don't necessarily connect and want to identify with that movement, and that links in then to social movement theory, which I'm looking at, and it talks about how the law can serve to both empower but also disempower people, because we're looking a lot at gender recognition and changing one's birth certificate or getting recognition within the law, but there's also many other issues that trans people are facing that the movement doesn't necessarily engage with. And also as well, for the likes of people in in academic circles, I come from a social science background, but I'm based in the School of Law. I find law very intimidating, so I can only imagine how, when a social movement is dominated by law, how that must feel maybe for somebody that doesn't necessarily know how to engage with that, when there's such a focus on litigation and looking at people who can engage and help the community through just litigation and not necessarily campaigning, but also then looking at how those campaigns and more kind of activist approaches can go hand in hand with litigation. So there's quite a lot there, and a lot of nuances which will be quite interesting to explore as well. So I'll just finish off by briefly mentioning what the overall aims and objectives are and some of the research questions that I've put together, just to give a bit of a better overview of the thesis, because I don't know how well it has come across just from talking off the top of my head. So the aims and objectives basically that I have written down for this are: taking Northern Ireland as a primary case study. I want to illuminate the understudied area of trans rights as both as a movement, but also as obviously an individual life story type methodology, using obviously oral history interviews. So it's given context and meaning with reference to the developments within the UK and the Republic of Ireland, but also globally as well. So domestic influences, campaigning tactics, strategies, and the use of litigation, media, forming alliances with human rights and other activists, but also then to document and probe the attitudes and perceptions of individual trans people in Northern Ireland with reference to their experiences of transphobia and transitioning, and then to provide a bridgehead between literature on social movement, gender inequality, and transitional justice. So just to briefly touch on transitional justice, the element of transitioning in my title it's sort of a double meaning. So we have the act of transitioning with reference to obviously to one's gender, but also then the fact that Northern Ireland is a transitional society. So as I move towards the end of the thesis, I will touch on transitional justice. So I'll wrap it up there just in case, because I've lost track of time and I don't actually know how long I've been talking for. So I'll wrap it up there. But yeah, any questions at all, feel free. I'm more than happy to answer them. And hopefully in the next couple of months, I'll actually be able to speak a little bit more about trans experiences and the actual nuts and bolts of the oral history interviews. But unfortunately, they couldn't go ahead because of the pandemic. And obviously, because I'm dealing with quite a vulnerable population, it would be, personally for me, very inappropriate to conduct oral history interviews through the likes of a Zoom or Microsoft Teams call. I think that sort of thing, especially with life story interviews, it needs to happen in person. So hopefully in a few months I'll be able to update everybody with some actual stats, findings, and all that sort of thing. So thanks very much, and I hope you've enjoyed everything that I've talked about, and it's made sense with this dodgy Northern Ireland accent. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Philip. No apologies for any kind of regional accents today, please. I think you've touched on something really important, just in the fact that many of us are facing similar issues with wondering about how and when we're going to get our research back off the ground. So that might even be something that people want to talk about, as part of our discussion at the end. And I think you raise a really important point actually about when we're working with marginalised communities, vulnerable people, things like that. The Oral History Society has produced a really helpful document about interviewing in in the pandemic, and does give some tips for remote interviewing for those people who want to do so. But I think, you know, as we as researchers in LGBTQ oral histories know, the rapport and the kind of, I don't know, materiality, the physicality of it is something that's so embedded in our discipline. And so for many of us, I think we're similar to you, that we don't want to go into remote. But anyway, that was just something that captured, I think probably captured quite a lot of people's immediate thoughts of how we're all dealing with this. Thanks so much. I was in Northern Ireland, when was it? A couple of years ago for the Oral History Society conference. Had a fantastic time, and yeah, loved hearing from some of the speakers there too. And some of the things you mentioned that were chiming were very similar to some of the major issues that they talked about then, Stormont being one of them. Anyway, we will now pass over to Jaime Valentine, who's going to talk to us about the work of OurStory Scotland. Jaime.
Hello. If we were doing an oral history of OurStory Scotland, we might begin in the way in which we often begin our oral histories, which is to say, tell us a bit about your early life. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the early life of OurStory Scotland. And we go back 19 years to 2001, when there was a meeting of a nicely named group called Diverse Artists at the LGBT Centre in Glasgow. And at the end of the final meeting in 2001, and it was the final point of the meeting, I asked a question, which was, is anybody recording the stories of the LGBT community in Scotland? Because we've seen such huge changes, and we're worried because these people who've seen these massive changes may not be with us for so much longer, so we need to capture those stories. And nobody knew if there was that going on at all, and so we decided we would do a study of this. We would try and report back. We would develop a kind of subgroup, and that eventually developed into OurStory Scotland. But I'll tell you a bit about the research that we did and what our aims were at the time. We went to look in different parts of the UK to see what people were doing, and one of the key projects that we found at the time was Brighton OurStory project, which sadly I believe is no longer, but they gave us fantastic support. They gave 5 hours of their time to indicate the kind of ways in which they had been collecting the stories. They gave us some tips, some indications of what we should do, and we stole their name. We stole the word OurStory from them because we thought that was a particularly good way to emphasize that basically LGBT people's stories had been told by others. They had been objectified, they'd been marginalized, they'd been often vilified or simply neglected and ignored. And so we wanted our stories from our voices, and that's where we took the name from. We also went to the British Library Sound Archive and spoke to the amazing Rob Perks, and Rob Perks gave us, again, amazingly for a new group that was setting up. We didn't even have a name at that point, but he gave us 2 hours of his valuable time and indicated to us the ways that we might proceed. And in many ways, we still continue with exactly those ways. We emphasize face-to-face oral history interviewing where we can do that. As Amy said, the remote interviewing is something we're looking into, but it's not going to have the same impact or the same quality as the face-to-face interviewing does have. We also asked him how we would archive our materials, and he emphasized that we should be doing summaries rather than transcriptions, and we're still doing that. And 2 of the people who are joining us in the wider group today, who are Dom and Lindsay, have been absolutely fabulous summarizers in the last 2 years, and have got a lot of the backlog of the summaries that we needed to do has now been done so that we can continue archiving them at the National Library of Scotland. From the beginning, we decided that what we would do would be to collect people's stories and to archive them because we wanted them to be available. We wanted them to be available safely and long term. And this is something which we were very aware of with the Brighton OurStory project because they didn't have that local connection, as far as I know, with a local museum or library. And we wanted to present them. We didn't want these stories just to remain in an archive, but we wanted people to get access to them and to be able to see them and to be able to engage with them, and for that to feed back into more stories as well. And just to emphasize that notion of presentation, right from the beginning, we started that. And so our opening project was actually an exhibition. So before we got any stories, we did an exhibition of the stories, which seems a bit back to front, but it's not if you think about it. If you tell people we're doing an exhibition, and the exhibition is going to be called Becoming Visible, rather a good title, you get people to come together, they develop their visual and verbal work, and we had that on all stages of the LGBT Centre. We had it upstairs, we had it on the staircases, we had it downstairs. It was a fabulous exhibition. You can still see it online on our website. And that dates right from 2002, which was also the date at which we started doing our oral history. We started our charity. Basically, we started establishing our organization, and we got charitable status 2 years later. Also, in terms of presentation, we realized from the beginning that we wanted to present these things live in storytelling, so that people could come along as audiences and hear these things. And so we started collaborating, and throughout our work, you can see that collaborating and cooperating has been one of the key things that we've wanted to do. We've not been jealously guarding our stories and not sharing them with people. We want to share them, we want to collect them with other people. We want them to be used as widely as possible in accordance with the people whose stories we're collecting, in accordance with their wishes. And so we worked with 784 Theatre Company Scotland, and this is part of the aspects of what we're looking at where you can see something which is unique in Scotland. In Scotland, 784 Theatre Company survived much longer than it had done in England. And it's one of the things that enabled us to work with that group, a radical theatre company who were concerned with representing our stories and adding fictionalized stories to them. I should say that looking back at it, it was very clear that the actual stories that we collected were far more interesting, far richer, far more ambiguous in a fascinating way than the stereotype stories that came through when people tried to write fictions about it. So actually it reinforced our idea that what we should be doing is oral history interviewing. We were also concerned that we would be able to archive the stories, and we didn't really want to collect the stories if they were going to remain in somebody's loft. And so we looked very carefully at where we might archive them, and we went round and inquired with libraries and museums in different parts of Scotland, and we tried to find if we could find anybody who'd be willing to take the stories. And at first, we didn't have any joy in that. And then in 2003, I was told of somebody in National Museum Scotland who was interested in the kind of social histories and in particularly recorded histories, and her name was Dorothy Kidd, and I got onto Dorothy Kidd and I asked her whether they might be prepared to take our materials. And I'd been so used to people saying, I'll think about it, I'll get back and talk with other colleagues, that when she said plainly yes, I actually had to ask her to repeat it. I didn't believe what she was saying, but she did mean yes. She came to see us. She talked about how we could go ahead with this, and that started an association with the National Museum Scotland, who now have over 170 handwritten episodes that have been submitted to OurStory Scotland, and we have more in the offing. There will be hundreds which are archived in National Museum Scotland. They already have more than 170 there. They've also taken our visual storytelling objects in order to develop this into an archive of visual storytelling of OurStory Scotland. So they've taken a selection of those as well. We looked around for other archives as well for our oral history interviews. And to be honest, given that that's a digital product, the museums were more concerned with physical objects. And for digital objects, we found that the National Library of Scotland actually were able to deal with that rather better. And so our digital recordings, both video recordings and audio files, are stored at the National Library of Scotland. And we feel very privileged that we have these national institutions which are very keen, very encouraging of what we're doing, of the work that we're doing. They know that we're going to present it in a format which is archive quality, and that we'll provide summaries to go with it so that people can hone into the bit that they're interested in looking at. And through that, we feel very privileged that we've got those institutions making our stories secure for all time. So in a way, I'm going backwards through collecting, archiving, presenting, looking at how we started off with presenting right from the beginning, looking at how archiving and finding a suitable archive is particularly important for us. And finally, if I can get on to looking at collecting and how we started doing that, we started in that oral history way, which we thought was going to be the heart of what we do. And I would say it still is the heart of what we do, which is one-to-one oral history interviews, which begin, tell us a bit about your early life. And the first one that we wanted to do, we decided who would we have first? And we were a bit worried because we thought if we had any one of L, G, B, or T, this was going to actually mean that the other ones will say, why did you start with them and not us? So in order to get round that, we found somebody, Steph, who identified as L, G, B, and T. And Steph is an intersex person, and Steph gave a wonderful interview, and Steph was the first interview we did. And later we took the pictures that we took at that interview, we developed them through part of our visual storytelling into screen prints, into silk screen prints. We then got that put up as kind of Chinese lanterns in our first major exhibition, which was at the largest and most important museum and art gallery in Scotland, the Kelvin Grove, which is in Glasgow. And we did our Space exhibition there in 2008. And Steph's lanterns were hanging up with wonderful tags on them saying, I am gay, I am lesbian, I am bi, and simply I am. And then we had a gender set, which is I am male, I'm female, I am trans, and simply I am. And in all those ways, actually Steph came along to the exhibition and took pictures of Steph's lanterns and was very happy with that. So we kind of got that feedback loop, which was also very positive. We found that over time, that the collecting has actually expanded into different ways. And when we got a grant to go all over Scotland, and it was called Queer Stories, we were collecting queer stories all over Scotland, we found that one of the key ways that people were able to do this was through those handwritten episodes that I've mentioned before that we've archived in the National Museum of Scotland. It means that people can look at a key episode in their life, at something where they became something different, they took on a new identity, or they recognized their identity, or they got other people to recognize their identity. And those key episodes in their life were something which they were able to provide to us at various events, at a Pride Festival, for example. In one case, it was a fabulous tent that we put up, the OurStory tent that we put up in Aberdeen. And the OurStory tent had someone who had a crystal ball inside who would help you to look at your story and to recognize your past. And Madame Historia, as this person was called, would get you to look in the crystal ball and encourage you to write your story. And we got 60 stories that day written in Aberdeen, which was quite extraordinary. From there, we actually found that that fed back into other things. So one of the stories we collected was a story from Nick, who identified as transgender, but was fantastically ambiguous in the way that Nick presented themselves and saying, I'm not this, I'm not that, I simply am. And through that, we decided to get Nick's oral history. We managed to trace Nick, we managed to get an oral history with Nick. We did the oral history in Crian Larich, and the oral history lasted almost 4 hours. In the middle of that, the dog got fed up, and you can hear the dog on the recording getting a bit pissed off with it and wanting literally to go and piss off outside. So we had a little break and then came back again. And we then wanted Nick to present. and we've emphasized how important presentation was. And so we had a ceilidh, a traditional Scottish ceilidh, even more traditional than traditional, in the sense that we reintroduced storytelling into the ceilidh. And we got 20 people from all over Scotland to come and tell their stories. We'd met them before during the Queer Stories project, and they came and did a live presentation. We recorded that, we did a video recording of that, and now that is also now archived at National Library of Scotland. I want to emphasize something about, because Philip did this so well for Northern Ireland, I want to emphasize something about the way in which we relate to the national picture in Scotland. Scotland underwent a huge transformation in the 20 years leading up to the foundation of OurStory Scotland. And that is one reason we wanted to capture these stories. We thought very few societies have undergone such a rapid change, particularly in relation to LGBTQ people, that we wanted to capture that. We saw that if you took, say, 1979 from the Thatcher government to coming to power for the first time to 1999, the formation of the Scottish Parliament, that 20-year period, or from 1980 when the Sexual Offences Act was brought into line with England and Wales after 13 years when we were different from that. If you take that 1980 figure and go on to 2000 with the repeal of Section 28, first in Scotland. So we then became, from having been grudgingly coming years behind, we then became at the forefront of progressive legislation. And we wanted to look at that. And so we were particularly concerned with making sure that we got that diversity represented and reflected the changes that had happened in Scottish society. I want to emphasize 3 projects that we've done in the way that we've reflected these changes in Scottish society over the years. One reflects diversity. Diversity from the beginning was a core of the Scottish Parliament and was signed up to by all the parties which were part of that Scottish Parliament. So in 2010, as a follow-up to the Scottish Arts Council funded Queer Studies project, where we looked all over Scotland, we did a project on Love Out of Bounds, which was attempting to look at intersectionality, again, as Philip had mentioned, intersectionality, looking at people who were LGBTQ and perhaps were BAME as well, from another minority group, another ethnic minority group, another religion, whatever it might be. And we did a project with them, which also, for the first time, tried to cross over that very difficult boundary between straight people and LGBT people. And we did this through Love Out of Bounds and emphasized that almost everybody, whatever their sexuality, whatever their gender, has had at one time somebody who has been regarded as inappropriate, as somebody who they can be in love with. And we found that we could get stories from straight people as well as LGBTQ people to emphasize that in common between people. We then went on to, in 2016, when we found that there was a huge increase in racism and xenophobia as a result of the EU referendum. Again, we wanted to reflect what we saw was perhaps a difference in Scotland, where all 5 political parties in the Scottish Parliament emphasised that people who had come into Scotland from overseas were not only important economically for Scotland, but were important culturally, that people who come into Scotland are part of who we all are. That was such a positive view. We wanted to emphasize this for LGBTQ people as well. And so we developed something a little different from coming out. We looked at coming in, and the Coming In project was concerned with LGBT people who'd come into Scotland, who'd moved away from where they had grown up and who were developing their identities in a new situation. And that was inaugurated at the National Library of Scotland, where our archives are. It was inaugurated in 2017. We had 60 people attend. We did a group recording, including people from Austria, Italy, Poland, Canada, Indonesia. We had a wide variety of people giving their stories there. And it emphasised again this very diverse aspect of Scotland, which we're particularly keen to reflect. And finally, the COVID, the dreadful COVID, and what we're doing about that. Well, we are emphasising something that we've always given as a chance for people to do, which is that they can share their stories at a distance. And so we've developed the Queer Distance project. And through Queer Distance, people can contribute their stories online, or we're also looking into the advice given by the Oral History Society about doing double-ended recordings and recording people and uploading that. We're still at the beginning of doing that. We don't know how successful it will be. We're not going to try and do full-scale oral history interviews, but possibly for themed interviews, this might be a way of progressing. And we're hoping to have conversations also between people, reaching out. This is an idea that Dom came up with, reaching out across different divisions within the LGBTQ community so that we will get people talk to each other and perhaps break down any of the barriers involved there. So that's where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Jamie. That was great. So nice to be reminded of all those. You know, some of them I thought, I forgot about that, and I forgot about that. Yeah, it was great.
You were involved in those, Amy.
Yeah, I know, and I always tell my students some of the books that I've got have still got my number written in the top corner, my name and my number. It's nice. It's not because it was a pickup thing that I was giving out books to people, but it's because I put them in our exhibition in the Kelvin Grove, and I was worried that the Kelvin Grove would steal all my books, and I've never. I said nothing like an exhibition where you have to bring all the materials yourself. All right, thanks so much, Jamie. Our last speaker is Norena Shopland, who's going to talk to us now about LGBT Welsh oral histories. Norena.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me at the back. My main work concerns researching and writing about the history of sexual orientation and gender identity in relation to Wales, and anything to do with Wales and Welsh. And I started looking at this Welsh history some years back when really nobody was looking at it. This is around 2010. And it was because of this lack of information and interest in Welsh history that I applied for a Heritage Lottery Fund grant and consequently set up a project called Welsh Pride. And we received a year's funding, and it culminated in the first exhibition of solely Welsh people, allies and events in 2012. And this groundbreaking work was used to form the main part of my book, Forbidden Lives, LGBT Stories from Wales, which was the first fully historical work on the history of sexual orientation and gender identity from a Welsh perspective. And one of the reasons that I was so keen to start working on this Welsh history is that because it spent so much time being subsumed into English history. And I became very frustrated when reading books and papers and other material, which while mentioning Welsh people and events, it was generally simply lumped under English, not even British, it was English. And few book texts or indexes ever referenced Wales. And so I wanted to address this For Wales See England theme. Has anyone ever heard of this? It's quite a famous quote in Wales, and it regards an index entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica. When looking up Wales, it redirected the reader to For Wales See England. And this is an ongoing problem with the dominance of the larger country, and it still causes difficulties today. Many other nations still refer to England instead of Britain or the UK, and many people still do not know about Wales, certainly in a lot less way than Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And even today, when I'm dealing with international people or organisations around the world, I'm still asked, where's Wales? Which is not all bad, because at least it provides me with an opportunity to raise awareness of our country. As part of this HLF project, I included an oral history element, And it was originally intended just to be 10 stories, but due to various complications with the project, only 6 were finally finished. And the way we did the interviewing, we did the normal warm-up questions, life in general. We looked at schooling, bullying, whether they recognized anybody else as gay, bisexual, trans. And we looked at the influences with growing up. And we also looked at their knowledge of LGBT plus when growing up, of the terminology that was used, who were their heroes on TV, in books, what were their knowledge of other people's sexual orientation or gender identity. And one of the themes that I wanted to explore quite closely was the migration of Welsh people, either to large Welsh towns or cities or to English ones, with a limited ability to socialise in Wales, and the added problem of people knowing each other, particularly in rural areas. Many individuals did move to large English cities, such as London, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. And this is a dominant theme in our history, that many people move to large urban areas in order to be, as they see, to move more freely. However, work that some people have been doing, and myself included, is not always, it doesn't always follow that theme. Certainly in historic terms, I've got a book coming out next year called Women in Male Attire, Their Right to Wear Trousers, published by Pen and Sword in June 2021. And it's looking at a lot of cross-dressing, from anything from heterosexual cisgender women who pass as men for either a short or a long period, and culminates in looking at individuals we would today identify as lesbian and those we would today identify as transmasculine. And one of the things that I have found in that work, and the work goes up to about the First World War, is that certainly in terms of those individuals we would term lesbian or trans men, they weren't moving so much to urban areas, they were moving to rural areas, and setting up home together and looking at and living together as a couple. And I certainly think a lot more work needs to be done on migration patterns, not just of the past, such as the 19th century, but also migration in the 20th century. As I said, with a lot of Welsh people, they did tend to migrate to England. But the thing what we were doing with the oral history is that we really wanted to concentrate on people living in Wales and getting the Welsh experience. We also looked at whether people were in relationships, civil partnerships, heterosexual marriages, and the pressures or the success of those relationships. We looked at travel, sort of foreign travel as in terms of holidays and things, socialization, and activism, again looking at what activism was happening in Wales. We also talked about attending prides. The first London Pride was in 1972. The first Pride in Wales was not until 1985. And thereafter there was nothing until 1999, and it didn't start again regularly until 2001, when Cardiff Mardi Gras was formed. And Cardiff Mardi Gras then put on a regular Welsh Pride, and consistently until today, and a few years back they changed their names to Pride Cymru. And in terms of other prides around Wales, they've been very sporadic. There have been prides that have come and gone, and it's only in the last 5 or 6 years that we've seen a regular starting up of more local prides like Llanelli and Rhondda. So the pride experience was predominantly an English one right up to 2001, and even then, even now, a lot of people in North Wales, particularly people who are sort of short of money and time, will tend to go to the Manchester and Liverpool events rather than the South Wales event of Pride Cymru. with the oral histories, we ended by asking how Wales could be a better place, and if allowed to speak to the Welsh First Minister, what would they say? And I can't repeat some of the comments that were made. There were key people that I was very, very keen to interview, particularly people who had played a prominent part in activism in Wales, but this raised certain problems. Many of those who did get involved in activism had moved, and they were now in England. And as I said, we did want to keep the interviews predominantly to those who were living in Wales. But for those in Wales, we had added problems in that key people tended to be known within the wider Welsh LGBT circuit, and many were afraid of their past being known. And there was also the problem of family knowing about their past. And some individuals whom I was very, very keen to interview, and I spent several years trying to engage them, didn't want to, because they had found a sort of equilibrium within the family, and they didn't want to bring all that up again. And there are still a lot of people that I would really like to interview who have been resistant, but I will keep working on them. So those who were interviewed included Berwyn Rowlands, who is the director of the Iris Prize, which is a prize-giving organisation to short LGBT plus films. And he tells the story of from originating from a small Welsh village to becoming very well known within the LGBT community, and very influential internationally. So his is a very interesting story. We spoke to a trans woman, and she gave us a very detailed story of her life. Unfortunately, as with many cases of trans women, a lot of it quite traumatic, and a lot of discrimination in there. But she does talk about other members of the family who they suspected were gay. We also talked to a gay man who had undergone conversion therapy, and that was very upsetting. It was, for him, it was the first time he'd ever spoken openly about it. And he saw it as something which helped him a great deal, because he had basically buried it in his past and never talked about it again until asked about in this interview. And whilst he did undergo some initial trauma for relating the story, in the end he found it quite a therapeutic thing to do. We also talked to a gay woman again who came from a relatively small village, but who went on to become a mental health counsellor, working particularly with LGBT plus people. We spoke to another gay man who related his life story, and he was worried about his story, because he basically said, well, I've got nothing to tell. And he saw himself as living quite a normal life. I don't know why you're interested in me, sort of thing. And yet some of the things he did tell us were very interesting, and some quite traumatic, being sexually abused when he was young. And we also spoke to Howard Llewellyn, who is very active not only in British LGBT activism, but he was the founder of the Gay Liberation Front in Wales. And certainly much more work needs to be done with Howard Llewellyn, because he's got an amazing record of activism, and his story is essentially still relatively untold. A long time, these other people that I said are key players that I really would like to interview. With the end of the project, there was no further money to spend, and so copies were passed to the Cardiff Story Museum, where volunteers are currently, I believe, transcribing the recordings, and copies were also passed to the National Museum of Wales. Since then, in terms of oral histories generally in Wales, some have been made by the National Museum, and others have done bits and pieces, but on the whole not a lot has been done, so we are very short of oral histories in Wales. And what we also need is a registry, not just here, to see, to make it clear what exists, what people are working on, so that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel and doing the same sort of thing. But also to share research and share results. And it's something that I looked at briefly. I've got a new book coming out called A Practical Guide to Searching LGBTQIA Historical Records, which is going to be published by Routledge on the 12th of November. And it's essentially a toolkit in how to research LGBTQIA historical records. And it covers all sorts of things from terminology, timelines, caveats, but also where to look and how to look. And in the book, I mentioned the fact that the British Library has a dedicated lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer special interest group. And as they point out on their webpage, many of these important collections, however, remain uncatalogued or held in places unknown to most researchers. And this I find is very true. Certainly when I looked at their page, the Welsh oral histories that we had done from 2012 were not included. And I did since notify them of these copies that are held at the National Museum and Cardiff Story Museum. So hopefully they will go up at some point. And in response to this, they have an ongoing project. They've got a map of LGBT plus oral histories in the UK. However, there's still a need to add general histories. I find the difficulty with oral histories that exist is the tagging. Tagging tends to be about the content, about what's being done, why it's being done, people being interviewed, and sort of passing comments tend not to be included. For example, in the Liverpool archives, there's an oral history by Mr. Dalton who mentions it. He starts talking about some homosexual sailors, and yet this is not included in the British Library LGBT plus map of oral histories. And so I think that in regard to tagging oral histories, we do need to think about cross-party working, about, if I can look at oral history, say, that have been done in Scotland or Sheffield, if people came from Wales, if they're talking about Wales, and vice versa. So I think that we really need to start looking at more effective tagging on places and themes. As I said, with the situation with oral histories in Wales today, there's not a lot, but I know Mark Etheridge at the National Museum Wales is working on some, and some other people are doing other bits and pieces. But really, as a country, we really do need to start looking at an effective programme for capturing more oral histories in this country. So that's just a very short roundup, so thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Norena. And thanks to all our speakers. Should we have a little virtual round of applause for everybody? Get my little reaction, hang on, there we go, clap.